Influencing popular culture, politics, and everything in between. The local station takes you ringside as we discuss the crazy world that is professional wrestling. This is Going Ringside with the local station.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Scott Johnson. This is episode 38 of Going Ringside. So glad you could be with us. The show continues to grow. I hope you'll still encourage people to spread the word about the show. If you know wrestling fans, fan groups, online groups, anyone who might like wrestling, tell them to give a check out to Going Ringside. Let them know we're out here. And once again, as always, give us a follow at Going Ringside on both TikTok and Instagram. Putting a lot of exclusive content there every single day, stuff that you see on the podcast, stuff that you don't see here on the podcast about the ongoing world of pro wrestling. So glad you could be with us. And before we move forward today, I want to talk a little about last week's episode 37. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts right now or on YouTube, Going Ringside episode 37, all about the Bushwhackers. The Bushwhackers, the legendary comedic tag team, and I make my case on why they were so good. Despite their goofball corniness, they were extremely over, extremely A-list famous in the wrestling world for a reason. Children and family love them, families love them, and you can go back right now, listen to what Bushwhacker Luke, who we have on the show, says they did at the White House. You'll want to hear that. I don't want to give it away, but you want to go back and check that out and see what the Bushwhackers had going on. We also discussed the future of John Cena, because there's a lot of talk of what is going to happen with him going forward. Did he have his last match at Crown Jewel now that the Hollywood actor strike is over? Is he going back to Hollywood forever, never to set foot as an active wrestler in a wrestling ring again? It's a possibility. We break it down on the last episode 37. Go check it out right now. Today, we are changing gears, so to speak, to something a lot more serious than what we've been talking about in recent weeks. We're talking about a murder case, and that would be the murder case involving Jimmy Superfly Snuka and the allegations of what happened with his then-girlfriend in 1983, and then eventually he was charged 30 years later. And we wanted to look at that case. We have a veteran homicide detective joining us a little later on in the show. He was one of the main detectives for many, many years with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office down here in Florida to help us pick apart this case, which is really odd to have a murder case where you have a person of interest not charged for 30 years. We're going to talk about that with him. And after that, later on the show, we'll also be joined again, who's joined us on the show a few times, Joe Vithiathil. He's a news anchor out at KPTV in Portland, Oregon, and a friend of the show and knows wrestling as well as anyone I've ever met. So he's going to give us some thoughts on the legacy of Jimmy Snuka in light of this case. So let's first talk about who Jimmy Superfly Snuka was. This all happened in 1983 when he was in the WWF. And this was an important time for the WWF, maybe the most important, because it was right as they were about to go national. This was about a year before Hulk Hogan beat the Iron Sheik and won his first heavyweight title with the WWF. Rock and Wrestling Connection with Piper and Mr. T. And I have an image that you can put on the screen of Piper and Mr. T and Jimmy Snuka in the ring. This was in that build-up with Rock and Wrestling Connection. The reason why I think this picture is important, because when you think of 1980s WWF, you think of Hulk Hogan. You think he was the guy that Vince McMahon built his empire on the back of. But if you ever ask wrestling fans, you know, if Hulk Hogan wasn't around, who would have been the guy for WWF to be the face of the company going forward? Most people agree it would have been Jimmy Snuka. Before Hulk Hogan, Jimmy Snuka was Vince McMahon's crown jewel. He was his megastar. He was the guy who was going to take Vince McMahon national, take him to the next level, and become this national icon wrestling figure. Jimmy Snuka was at the peak of his celebrity in 1983. Fans loved him all over the area. And when I say area, I mean the Northeast, because this was as Vince was changing. He was starting to get his product on cable systems throughout the country and eventually put all the competition out of business. That's your AWA, your UWF, your Mid-South. To an extent, the NWA, which was his only real competition after everyone else folded. But Vince is about to go national. So this is a very important time for his business. Stop being the Northeast regional territory in New England and New York and become a national brand. And Jimmy Snuka was a big part of that. So Jimmy Snuka was known for his high-flying abilities. Fans loved him. Mick Foley, a.k.a. Cactus Jack or Mankind, famously said Jimmy Snuka influenced him to get into pro wrestling. When he saw in 1983 Jimmy Snuka in a steel cage against Don Morocco, and Jimmy Snuka, well before this was something that wrestlers would ever think of doing, he climbed at the top of that near 20-foot high steel cage and jumped off the top of it. And Mick Foley, famous for getting thrown off the top of a cage by The Undertaker about 15 years after that, says that influenced him. He's like, I want to do that. Jimmy Snuka was legendary in the industry at this point. However, Jimmy Snuka had a lot of demons and personal issues going on. I'm going to reference a few things in this podcast. One of them is the Dark Side of the Ring episode. Dark Side of the Ring, if you're not familiar, is that documentary series that Vice did on many of the controversies that have come out over the years in WWF and WWE and pro wrestling, from the murder-suicide involving Chris Benoit to the death of Owen Hart and other tragic issues in the ring. And they, of course, talked about the Jimmy Snuka case. So I will reference that throughout the show. And there have been other articles. I mean, the Jimmy Snuka case is something that's been talked about a lot. So in a lot of the reporting, Jimmy Snuka had substance abuse issues, namely the one that was talked about in the Dark Side of the Ring, and a lot of other coverage of this is that he had an issue with cocaine. And if you've studied wrestlers and their lifestyle in the 1980s, it was a party, rough lifestyle. Guys going town to town, living in and out of hotels, on the road. Drugs and alcohol were embedded in this world. Some guys were cleaner than others. For instance, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. They always say Steamboat was just a clean guy. We had Hacksaw Jim Duggan on a number of episodes ago, and he said, you know, I had some issues with that, but I never got hooked on it. Jake the Snake Roberts, on the flip side, did get hooked. And you can go back and watch our Jake Roberts episode. He struggled with drugs and alcohol for many, many years. So it was a reality for many wrestlers. And the reporting has been that Snook had an issue with cocaine. So one of the things that came out of this was that Snuka, the way of wrestling back then was you had to drive town to town. He lived in and out of hotels. And Snuka was married at the time, but he was on the road most of the year. His wife lived states away, and they had children. And so Jimmy Snuka had a guy who would help him make his dates and get around town. And Jimmy, had a rough upbringing. I've seen some reporting that he may have had issues with reading and writing. And so they kind of had a person on the road with him. And one of the people who was on the road went to Vince McMahon and said, I can't handle him. He's too crazy. He's too wild. And there were the drugs and the other issues. So along the way, there was this young woman named Nancy Argentino. She was a young, attractive woman in her early 20s, and she went to a couple wrestling matches with a guy. I want to say she was linked with Johnny Rodz. He was a wrestler back in the day. And she met Jimmy Snuka, and this is detailed in that Dark Side of the Ring. And they became close and eventually started dating. And eventually, she started kind of being the person who would guide Jimmy from town to town and get him where he needed to go. And the Tonga Kid, I believe, is the Sammy Fatu is the one who would also travel with them. And Jimmy brought him in and helped guide him from town to town. So they would go everywhere together. And it was just the lifestyle back then. So Jimmy would drive around, and there were concerns that between Jimmy and Nancy Argentino, that there had been some abuse issues. The main issue that came about was 1983. In early 1983, months before she lost her life in January, that police in an area in one of the towns they were in had been called to a hotel room where they were staying after people complained about, worrying a woman was being assaulted or attacked or abused. Police come and they find Jimmy Snuka. And a lot of the reporting is multiple officers had to restrain him, and they said it was almost like he had superhuman strength. And Jimmy kind of did. I mean, he was incredibly strong, gifted, top-level athlete with the WWF. He could do a lot of things, and he was a very strong man. So to an average person, even an average police officer, containing him, maybe if he's in a drug-induced state, would be very, very difficult. And this did make some news back then. Now keep in mind, this is important as we go forward in the show. The difference in the world in 1983 versus what you see today. Keep in mind, there was no internet, no social media. The only way you would know something happened in the world is maybe you might see it on the TV news, but most likely you would read about it in the local paper wherever you're at. The newspaper was by far and away the main way that people got their information, and there were limits to it. So, for instance, if a celebrity did something bad today, as soon as the news is out for anyone, within an hour, half the country knows about it. You get an alert on your phone. It's on all the networks. It's on X or Twitter. It's everywhere. Back then, none of that existed. None. At best, a newspaper would pick it up. And maybe it would be circulated on the news wires to other news agencies, but that was kind of a crapshoot if that would ever happen. I mean, the reporting back then is a reporter would hear about it and read about it maybe in the police blotter, or they had a contact at the police station who might tell them about it and would get a small write-up in the paper. Every once in a while, you might have a crime that does get larger distribution in multiple newspapers, but that takes a lot. So Jimmy Snuka, who's very famous at this point, being involved in an altercation with police was newsworthy, but eventually Nancy Argentino drops the charges. She does not press charges. There's been a lot of speculation over the years of why she didn't press charges at the time, but she didn't, and they get back to life. And so this story was able to be contained to minimal coverage, and this was important to pro wrestling. Because if a popular wrestler today got in trouble with the law, we'd know about it immediately. People didn't know Jimmy Snuka was in trouble with the law. It maybe made a few newspapers, but the vast majority of wrestling fans didn't know it. They just saw the guy on television who was their hero. And Vince McMahon could keep putting him on television because the vast majority of people didn't know what happened to Jimmy Snuka. It's why you hear stories about wrestlers back in the day at bars or nightclubs or having fights here and there. The people, you didn't know about it. There just was not, we were not in the information age yet. So they were able to contain this. And I've gone through a lot of the documentation, particularly on the initial January 1983 concerns about abuse. And you go through it and you see the lawyers wrote notes to the police officers saying he was sorry, he felt remorse, and he essentially almost got a legal slap on the wrist, but never did any jail time. One thing that I thought was interesting was police even documented seeing Snuka on TV in a neck brace. I want to read you, put a quote up on the screen. I want to read you a quote from the Onondaga Law Enforcement Information System. This is one of the things police put in one of their reports. In reference to the above arrestee, this writer, the officer, observed the arrestee on national television approximately 3 to 4 weeks ago on a sports program called World Championship Wrestling. The program is televised by WTBS Atlanta, Georgia, where the event allegedly took place. I think this is when Vince McMahon tried to take over Georgia Championship Wrestling before NWA was on TBS. It's kind of called, I think, Black Monday is very famous in wrestling history. Anyway, during the program, Mr. Snuka was interviewed by a television commentator who was allegedly his professional manager. During the interview, Mr. Snuka appeared with a neck brace on. Supposedly, Mr. Snuka had been recently injured by another wrestler during a recent wrestling match. The exact extent of his injuries was not discussed during the interview. However, mention of a neck and back injury was made. Additionally, the commentator elicited a response from Mr. Snuka that the injury was not permanent and that he, Snuka, would be back wrestling within a week or two. I just thought it was really interesting that they were including in their reports, in their police reports, seeing Jimmy with a neck brace doing an interview on television. You can come back to me on camera here, but it's almost like the kayfabe and the storyline of wrestling and the reality was bleeding over, and police were trying to kind of wade their way through it. I think like Bobby Heenan wore a neck brace in the 1980s. Much of it was because he actually did have an injury with his neck. It wasn't all gimmick. You know, sometimes you would kind of turn maybe a real injury into a gimmick on camera, and you wouldn't be sure what was gimmick and what was real. But eventually, those charges just went away. Jimmy Snuka and Nancy Argentino were back on the road again, back dating. And in the Dark Side of the Ring documentary, they interviewed Nancy Argentino's sisters, who talk in depth a lot about concerns they had about Jimmy. And changes in Nancy and some concerns that Jimmy, A, was violent, and B, that they were aware he had drug issues. Cocaine and drugs in the 1980s may be a little different in the early 80s as far as the public opinion on it. I was a kid at the time, I don't know. But they were aware of Jimmy, and they expressed some reservations. So that is January 1983 when that domestic issue happens. Fast forward 4 months to May. They're in a different city in the Northeast, a different town after having an event there. And after the event, they're back in a hotel. And this is when Nancy Argentino loses her life in May of 1983. Jimmy had said that they were driving and she had a fall, a bad fall, and hit her head when they pulled over and she needed to use the restroom while they're traveling around. And then he took her to the George Washington Motor Lodge, is I think what it is. It's now the site of a Home Depot near Allentown, Pennsylvania. This was in a different municipality, but near Allentown, which is a common stop for WWF. And they would go to Allentown a lot. They were big business back then, particularly for that area. And he gets back to the hotel, and she's not doing well at all, grasping for breath, problems. Eventually, police are called. They go in, and eventually Nancy Argentino died. And they found traumatic brain injuries, and they had Jimmy there. And we're going to talk about the homicide detective a little later about this. And so they had a dead woman. They had the man there, really the only one who they would have believed could have had anything to do with it. Was it accident? Was it accidental? Was it not? Police detectives had to go in and determine this. And Jimmy was broken up, they say, but he was never criminally charged. And over the years, Jimmy Snuka has had stories slightly change, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But at the end of the day, they never charged him with murder back in 1983. So I want to put something else on the screen. And this came from the autopsy report. Let me pull it up so I can read it a little better for you. After review of the history and complete autopsy of the body of Miss Nancy Argentino, death is attributed to craniocerebral injuries, the pattern of which is consistent with a moving head striking at the stationary object, but is not consistent with a single simple fall in view of the multitudinous other scalp, facial, bodily bruises and abrasions. The multiplicity and magnitude of the injuries may even be suggestive of mate abuse. So the autopsy, the coroner is seeing other injuries on Nancy Argentino's body. It's kind of a red flag in a police investigation. You know, is there a pattern of abuse? I don't recall if the police at the time had immediate access and knew about that incident in January. But he's never charged. I do want to mention one thing, and I don't want to get into it too much in this case because on our episode, because I don't have all the details. There's been a lot of reporting on it about Vince McMahon and kind of being a resource for Jimmy through this process. In the Dark Side of the Ring episode, they report a couple things. They report that McMahon was in touch, I think it was on a phone call with detectives, where he told detectives that Jimmy will cooperate fully with any police investigation, and he got Jimmy back on the road, wrestling back on his regular schedule, because Jimmy needed to go to town and needed to be on camera and at wrestling events wrestling. The other one from Dark Side of the Ring is the sisters say that Jimmy's promoter, is how they referred to him in the episode, called their mother on the phone. And they say that that phone call involved the promoter, we have to assume it's McMahon, because that was Jimmy's promoter at the time, offering the family money, and they were outraged by that. And I don't know that they ever accepted any money or not, but eventually the family did file a wrongful death lawsuit against Jimmy Snuka. And they were successful. I want to say it was for like $500,000. And there's been a reporting that Jimmy never paid a cent. Jimmy never paid them. But they did have, you know, they were able to justify a wrongful death lawsuit against Jimmy Snuka because he was present. Did he respond enough? Did he get her medical attention immediately? So they won that wrongful death lawsuit. And there was one other thing that came up years later when Jimmy Snuka eventually wrote his autobiography, and it involves Vince McMahon. And I'll just read this that he wrote in his book, and it's what he put out there. Here it is. You can put it on the screen right now. From his book, Superfly, The Jimmy Snuka Story. This is what he wrote. Shortly after Nancy's death, I was questioned by police and let go. At one point, I went with Vince McMahon Jr. to either a court or law office. I don't remember which because I was still in shock. All I remember is he had a briefcase with him. I don't know what happened. I think Vince Jr. picked me up from the hotel room and took me there. He didn't say anything to me. I don't know if he gave Nancy's family money or anything. The only thing I know for sure is that I didn't hurt Nancy. So this is what he puts out there many, 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 many years later. In the around 2010 to 2013 time frame, right around the time some journalists start looking into this old Jimmy Snuka case, because it eventually went cold. He was never charged with a crime, and eventually it just went away. Jimmy Snuka went about his life again. He started wrestling in '84, and he was very popular, and then eventually he was let go from WWF. He tried some lesser companies, and eventually, you know, was a semi-retired. WWF would bring him back every once in a while for some like Legends matches. I think we have an image of one here. I think Chris Jericho was involved in the match. And he would pop up here and there over the years. But as far as being an active performer, the last time I remember Jimmy Snuka in any sort of legitimate event would have been the early 90s when The Undertaker just showed up, and The Undertaker was brand new, and his first ever opponent at a WrestleMania was Jimmy Snuka, and he beat Jimmy Snuka. And that was the last time I ever remembered Jimmy Snuka being like a regular active performer, not a guy that's just brought in for nostalgia. But, you know, in all these years, and eventually the internet starts to come around. I was a wrestling fan. I never knew about these allegations against Jimmy Snuka. I never knew he was involved in death because so many years had passed from 1983 to the internet age, when people started to learn more behind the curtain, and we were able to regularly share articles by the late 1990s. For the most part, the world forgot about Nancy Argentino and forgot about the Jimmy Snuka case, that he had been with a woman who died. And the case went cold, just didn't really exist anymore. Until 30 years later, when some reporters in the Northeast at a local, newspaper decide to start looking, maybe we'll do a check on this case again. Maybe we'll start looking at it and do a 30-year retrospective on what happened with Jimmy Snuka, whose story had subtly changed over the years of what happened with Nancy Argentino. And they reopened the case. And then the public starts getting wind of it, as do police investigators, because the case was never considered closed. It was still an open homicide investigation. Homicide investigations never really close. And eventually it's put to the grand jury. And Jimmy Snuka is indicted for third-degree murder. And I would say this like 2013 or so. But there's a lot happening with Jimmy Snuka right at this time. Jimmy Snuka's health is starting to fail considerably. He has, I think, a stomach cancer diagnosis, and there were concerns that Jimmy Snuka wasn't altogether upstairs, that the time in the ring over the years had taken its toll on Jimmy Snuka, and he had severe neurological and brain damage issues. And in the Dark Side of the Ring episode, they'll say when this finally went to court, Jimmy didn't even totally understand what was going on. And Jimmy Snuka was eventually deemed by the judge unfit to stand trial. And then in months after that, Jimmy Snuka passed away. This all happened in a quick, about a year amount of time, from Jimmy Snuka being starting to reopen the investigation, to the indictment, to the court hearings where he's deemed unfit to stand trial, to his death. And that's where it ended. So there was never really any justice, and there was never really any chance for Jimmy Snuka to make his case in a court of law, because he was unfit for trial and he passed away. So there was never really any conclusion to this story, no definitive conclusion. He was charged with a crime, he was indicted, but he was not convicted. Innocent until proven guilty. I've covered dozens and dozens, hundreds probably of murder trials in 25 years as a journalist, and there's a difference between the charging of a crime and the conviction of a crime. He was never convicted. So the Argentino family never totally got justice, and we don't know that this case was ever totally solved, but the coroner is saying that it appears like this should be open and viewed as possibly a homicide, not necessarily just an accident. So I kind of reached out to a homicide investigator I've known named Tom Hackney. He was a former director with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office here in Florida, and he has worked several high-profile murders, a lot over the years, and everything from kidnappings to drive-bys to, what's important, domestic murders, crimes of passion, manslaughter, things that are maybe similar to the case that was concerned with Nancy Argentino and Jimmy Snuka. Because I wanted to get his opinion on this. He's dealt with so many, and he's also was a detective for so many years, he kind of understood the difference between homicide investigations 20, 30 years ago versus what you expect today, or around the time of this 2010 to 2015 time range. Because I wanted to get his opinion, and he said, this seemed like a very cut and dry case from a homicide investigator's perspective. So I wanted to get his opinion. Here's our interview with now retired but veteran homicide investigator Tom Hackney. Well, we are joined right now by veteran retired police detective, dealt with a lot of homicides over the years, Tom Hackney, to discuss this. Tom, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely, Scott, thanks.
So Tom, this is a very odd case. It looks like they have maybe the suspect, maybe the killer in 1983, but nothing comes of it, and it goes cold for 30 years until it's finally reopened. Have you ever seen anything like this?
Of this nature, no. This is a case that pretty much on the surface, as you look at it, you know kind of what's happened with that, and it was a little surprising to kind of dig into it and see that it went cold.
So let's talk about where this was versus, we understand modern police work. You have DNA, you have cell phone records, GPS. You had none of that. This is small town, 1983, and your suspect is a celebrity at the peak of his celebrity. Talk to me about the dynamics of police work here, that's just kind of a different ballgame than maybe what you were even used to.
Yeah, so as I started coming up, the DNA and the use of DNA and the use of cell phone and technology, just every case, you got to do a little bit more. When you would go back and you would look at some of those cold cases, you'd really scratch your head about what wasn't done or what they didn't know, and you look at it through your eyes, through the lens of the current time, and you think, wow, if I only knew this and that, how much different it would have been. And you look 30 years ago at this case, much of the same thing exists.
So as far as cold cases on a homicide, they kept this open. Do they just keep this in paper files somewhere? I mean, because 30 years is a long time to hold on to something.
A lot of time it's the hand-me-downs. When you come in and out of a homicide unit, especially in some of the smaller agencies, you get a box. Here's your box, and here's your box of cold cases. And depending on what your workload is, you delve into that. And there's some benefit to that as a new investigator. You get a new set of eyes. You get somebody who has had the latest training, maybe not the most experience, but sometimes the mix between those two can really be helpful in cold cases.
Talk to me about the dynamic here of this is odd because this is a guy who's very famous at this point in an industry that's believed to be real in 1983. And he's popping up in your police precinct, and the stories are that his boss, the owner, Vince McMahon, comes, maybe met with detectives, and there's been a lot of speculation online, and I don't want to point any fingers there. But talk to me about for the detectives, could that have impacted them at all?
Oh yeah, first of all, cops in general love wrestling.
Okay.
And back in the day, 30 years ago, these guys are it. They're the thing. And if you start seeing the guy that from Saturday morning wrestling walking in your office, and then you see his boss, the guy who's the really top pinnacle of all this, in and around, it's no surprise that could have something to do with it. It certainly could muddy the waters.
What would have had to happen for police in 2014, 13, whatever it was, to say, more stuff starts coming out, the internet and social media, everyone's talking about it, to them we need to pull this file?
Yeah, it's again, it goes back to maybe that new detective came through, wanted to take a fresh set of eyes at it. Throughout some of these smaller agencies, you get different bosses that come in that have interests in different levels that will give it to you to look at, and that's all it takes is one person to kind of scratch it off and take another look.
I want to go back to the original investigation. You say it was pretty cut and dry because you say, she had a blow to the head. His story changed a little. And then they find marks on her. Is that part of and the marks on her they believe were from past incidents, not the incident. I think that it was a head trauma.
Right, I think.
Yeah. What's a detective doing at this point? His story's changing, but I don't know that they know that his story's changing. Nowadays, when you hear stories changing for a celebrity, he says one thing online, says something on social media. Back then, it's a totally different ballgame.
It's quick and easy to go back and look at the soundbite from
Sure.
In today's world. Then, there's not a whole lot that you could do. And in some of the smaller jurisdictions, you may have something that occurred in another jurisdiction right next door that you wouldn't have knowledge about. So, it's one of those things that it's a level of difficulty that they have, and also with experience levels.
And on a domestic case, you've probably dealt with a lot of domestic homicides. He's saying it was an accident. He's crying, he's emotional. He's saying she hit her head. What police work is done to determine cause of death, and can that be not necessarily definitive?
Yeah, there are times that you have a story that will coincide with what your physical evidence says, and it is difficult to do. And some of that comes with the prosecutor as well. It's a team thing that goes between the investigator, the prosecutor, as well as the medical examiner to all get together and talk about the cause of death and what could have happened, what was the method of injury here, what could have caused the injuries that she had.
Does it get to the point where the detective goes and meets, here in Florida it'd be state attorney, it's county prosecutor, whatever the jurisdiction. Do you get to the point where you go meet with the lawyer for the state or the county and they're like, I don't know that I can prosecute this. Is that part of it?
And that involves some of the frustration that you have investigating homicides, where you may know who has responsibility for a crime, but to reach a level of a successful prosecution, you're just not there.
Could that have been a reality here?
Yeah, honestly, that could have been back in the day. And again, you fix all the influences that could be there, and you have him telling a story. I've got really nothing that can disprove his story.
Because you have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
Absolutely. I always have to remind detectives that this isn't about making an arrest. This is about a successful prosecution. That's the end. That's when it's done.
We talked earlier in the interview about someone powerful from the outside coming in. Let's just talk about like a lawyer. If someone's got a really good lawyer, can that make an impact in cases like these?
Oh, absolutely.
How so?
Well, it's an external force that comes in and can help that person accused of a crime. It can help direct things or direct attention away from them. Certainly, if somebody doesn't want to make a statement based on what their attorney, and of course they have every right to do that within the Constitution.
Sure.
But that can hamper the investigation. It certainly can kind of tie the hands of the investigator, and that may reach that point that prosecutor says, hey, I don't have quite enough there.
And is it typically the prosecutor, the coroner or medical examiner, and the detectives kind of working together on that decision?
It's kind of the triangle of those three pieces that you need to put together, and you may have a medical examiner or a coroner who doesn't quite have it there, who says
he's saying, I'm looking at that, but I can't definitively say that's what caused it.
And again, that's where the detective comes in, who wants to help them determine what the method of the injury is. If in this particular case she's got a head wound, what could have caused that head wound? Is there a weapon that they could find that caused that? Is it something in the room where they were? And all three of those pieces work together, and the prosecutor knows what they need to be able to successfully prosecute, and kind of directs the other two. The medical examiner or the coroner is based on their medical expertise. So there's no external influence. It's science, and that's what you have there. It's
science in 1983.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the good and the bad thing is the forensic pathology, even back then, although it wasn't involving DNA and it wasn't involving some of the other things, it still is what it is. It is a homicide by way of blunt force trauma that maybe I don't know the weapon.
Last question. On the 30 years, which just fascinates me, like why wasn't this reopened at 10 years or 15 years or 20? Talk to me about the reality of cold cases. I mean, can they just sit in a file and kind of after 5 or 6 years kind of be forgotten about by detectives?
The unfortunate truth is, yes, based on, again, kind of the level of work. When in Jacksonville here, when we have an exceptionally high year, that kind of takes detectives' time. Now, the sheriff's office here has a cold case unit that's directed towards doing that. But again, officer-involved shootings.
But in Jacksonville, that's a major agency as opposed to a small.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You've got the fact that Jacksonville has a full-time team dedicated to this is the exception and not the rule. Some of those smaller agencies, again, like I say, you get the hand-me-down box when you come in.
Yeah.
So if their direction isn't towards that, it'll gather dust on a shelf.
Tom Hackney, retired police detective. Thank you for your time. I appreciate
Absolutely,
you dealt with a lot of homicides like these, but this is definitely a unique one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Tom. So I appreciate Tom coming on to kind of give us the perspective of the homicide. And as he said, after so many years, these things can, agencies just move on. They've got other homicides they need to crack, and it is what it is. There was never a full conclusion to the death of Nancy Argentino. The family did not get justice. Jimmy Snuka never saw a trial, both due to the aspect of him being deemed unfit to stand trial and of course, passing away. The family did get a modicum of justice with their wrongful death lawsuit against him, but he never paid. So there's that. But the question in the world of pro wrestling is, what is Jimmy Snuka's legacy? Prior to this happening and coming back up around 2013, there were some whispers about Jimmy Snuka's past, but for the most part, he was a revered legend in pro wrestling. They would bring him back a lot. I mean, he would show up, the fans would pop, the fans would get excited. He had children, a son and daughter who tried wrestling. But after the news of the murder started to come out, when it was reopened and eventually the case went to a judge, Jimmy Snuka's legacy started to have a little asterisk next to it. I think Mick Foley has been, quoted, I don't have the quote in front of me, but it's saying it's kind of inextricably linked to him now. I mean, you can't not see it. Even though he was never convicted of the crime, he was still charged with murder. The legendary status kind of goes away then. WWE has released statements a couple times on this over the years, just saying we need to let the legal process play out, which is typically out of corporation to respond to something like that. But I wanted to bring in Joe V. Joe V is Joe Vithayathil is an anchor at KPTV out in Portland, Oregon. Huge wrestling fan and historian. Kind of wanted to get his perspective on this. On the legacy of Jimmy Snuka now, going from one of the guys who was considered one of the greats of all time to having this asterisk next to his name that he was charged with a third-degree murder. Here's our interview with Joe V.
Well, we're joined again by Joe V to talk about this issue of the legacy of Jimmy Snuka, not the ins and outs of the lawsuit and the investigation, which we've been talking about here, but Jimmy Snuka and his legacy following what happened with the charges that were filed before his death. Joe V, thanks for joining us, and your thoughts on what this did to the legacy of Jimmy Snuka, who was really beloved for many years.
No, I mean, well, first of all, let's put Snuka in his just on the wrestling side of things in proper context. I mean, he was the biggest babyface star in WWE right before Hulk Hogan took off. I mean, He was selling out Madison Square Garden, tippy top star. It's kind of been well documented that he had demons and personal issues. I've heard stories from other wrestlers about him that I won't repeat here, but that involved, basically fighting demons, and substance abuse, and that sort of thing. I mean, look, you just can't, and I feel the same way about, and I want to point out, I don't know all the finer points of the Jimmy Snuka case. I just don't, so I don't want to be an expert on that. But anytime there's allegations or actual charges of you taking someone's life, I mean, all the wrestling stuff seems kind of inconsequential. It's just hard to get excited. I can't watch a Chris Benoit match. I won't do it. Some people are fine with it. I actually interviewed Chris Benoit. He put me in the crossface. This was years ago. Took pictures with him. Could not have been a nicer guy. I won't watch a match with Chris Benoit. And quite honestly, it's kind of hard to look at Jimmy Snuka the same way. I mean, it's just, again.
This happens, and I'm assuming there's rumors and backstage discussion about it along the way in the early to mid 80s. He had a lengthy career after this. I mean, he continues at WWE to the early WWF through the early 90s. They keep bringing him back in kind of a legend status. Do you think that damages WWF, that they kept bringing him back as long as they did when maybe there was a specter behind the scenes? Although I guess it wasn't really public at that point, not until it in the mid 2000s when, the cases kind of reopened and gained steam again. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't know every aspect of this case. I don't know what Vince McMahon knew or didn't know or how involved he was. I don't know any of that. So I don't want to sit here and speculate about, well, they knew this happened and they shouldn't have. All I did know is that the fans didn't know about it. I didn't know about it. I had no problem cheering at Jimmy Snuka. I would have been excited to see him. I remember when The Rock brought him and Don Morocco out at backstage at WrestleMania 20. It was exciting to see him. So, look, he wouldn't be the first questionable character that was, brought out on a wrestling program, despite there being allegations against him. But I don't want to cast stones at WWE because I just don't know what they knew.
Sure.
I'm not an expert on that.
Do you think this kind of just essentially tarnishes his legacy? Maybe not to the extreme of Benoit, but I mean, Jimmy was somewhat of a beloved figure in the industry. And then this comes out prior to his death.
I don't think there's any question about it. I mean, it's an extremely dark, at the very least, a very, very dark cloud over Jimmy Snuka. And I would say it's a shame because he was a great wrestler, but when you're talking about issues of life and death, wrestling doesn't matter. And so, I think it does. I mean, I think it does for a lot of people. Now, look, that doesn't mean I'm telling people never watch a Jimmy Snuka match or you're a bad person. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying, for me personally, yeah. I mean, I think it's obviously a really dark shadow that, understandably, a lot of people are never going to get past.
Well, Jovi, thanks again for your perspective on this. We'll see you next time.
All right, man.
So it's kind of where we're at. The legacy is tarnished. He was never convicted in her death, but he was charged with third-degree murder in a case where he never was deemed not guilty. It just never went to trial. He was elderly. His brain was not in great shape, and he couldn't stand trial, and he passed away. It is a tragic story all the way around, particularly for the family of Nancy Argentino, who never got the justice, who never got the closure. I have covered hundreds and hundreds of homicides over the years. My other job is as a TV reporter. And the family, particularly in the ones that are unsolved, always say, we just want closure. They never got it. They never got it. And you have to know, before those journalists in around 2013 start digging this up again and eventually goes to grand jury, they were probably the only ones who remembered it, because it was the early 1980s. Those things get buried. They get forgotten about. The internet, in a lot of aspects of society, if it didn't happen before the late 90s and it wasn't a major event, it's almost like so much didn't happen, because there is no internet record of it existing. But it did come out again. I mean, Jimmy Snuka was charged, and it's horrific. His stories changed over the years, and people, had a lot of trust issues there, and the grand jury felt there was enough to indict. And so they did. And I do want to say, if you ever do go watch this episode of Dark Side of the Ring, we're going to link it in my article on this at news4jax.com, which episode it is. They do interview one of the police supervisors from that agency in it. He's in it a lot. They ask him a lot of questions. You can go and listen to him and see what you think. But that's kind of where it's at. It is one of those sad skeletons in the history of wrestling's closet. You think of Chris Benoit. You think of the Jimmy Snuka murder. I think those are kind of the other ones. You have the other tragedies like Owen Hart, the murder of Bruiser Brody, but where a wrestler has been charged as a killer, it tarnishes his legacy. There's no question about it. So I appreciate you sticking with us for this episode of Going Ringside. Hope to have a much more upbeat one and positive one, not such a downer like this episode was, but it was an important episode, one I definitely wanted to tackle, because it's really a historical thing in the world of pro wrestling. A young lady whose life was just taken too soon. But we appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us today. We'll see you next time on Going Ringside.
This has been Going Ringside with The Local Station, brought to you every Wednesday on your favorite podcast player, on News4Jax Plus, as well as the News4Jax YouTube channel.